Hello and welcome. Thank you for watching this presentation. The Language of Special in the Culture of Education, Session 1. I am Dr. Laura Chapman if you're searching for references, but my friends, colleagues and enemies call me Mole, which I prefer. Module aims. You'll be conversant with the aims of the modules by now, to become aware of ideologies within education, to think about the assumptions we make as professionals and question their relevance to academic theory and institutional policy. In this presentation, my job today, as I have defined it, is to talk about how our language influences beliefs and influences thinking, practice, culture and policy. I will critique the way we talk about Sen within our schools and within education, pointing out how this impacts negatively on the learning of those labeled. I ask the question, how do we begin a conversation about disability within a wider culture that speaks to individualized problems and medical solutions to matters of well-being? I suggest that because we rarely speak of the discrimination and inequality labeled individuals face. It is underestimated by many, and a huge cost to labeled learners and their families, schools, education and society more widely. In voicing our fears about disability, we seek to understand the problem as a lack of nuance on the subject. Learning about discrimination, as a protected characteristic, helps at this nuance in our wording of who is affected by what. When diagnosis is required for support, labeling is equated to illness, and viewed as a personal problem, rather than understood as the systemic or societal disadvantage weighing on those labeled. Institutional discrimination and societal injustice, thus, in the way we talk about labeled learners as a group, a population, within society, is critical to how we speak about organizational responsibility, and can help us speak of education without forgetting the voices of labeled learners it has a duty to serve equitably. Definitions. I will use keywords as shortcuts, to avoid the longer phrases that do not trip off the tongue. Learners include labeled special educational needs and disabled learners, to articulate the idea that while individuals may not identify as disabled or having special educational needs, the situation they face is often similar, even if the groups are not exactly overlapping. Schools cover early years, colleges and universities, PRUs, and other settings within education more widely. Professional refers to teachers, as workers with skill, knowledge and know-how in paid roles. Professionalism assumes working wisdom, employment skills and disciplinary knowledge, and sometimes a defined activism. Invitation. How do we begin a conversation about the barriers disabled people face, and the disability discrimination they encounter, in order to be proactive about a safe space for all? It makes sense to address this matter in a proactive way before we invite more people to join in. A welcoming environment is one that fosters belonging, so asking those already present questions that anyone can answer. What do you need to participate? Ableism, the discrimination imposed on labeled learners, is so deeply woven into society's storytelling, it is everywhere, but yet also unremarkable, and thus can be ignored easily. Much like ideas of classism and racism, you may not have the words for it even if you are subject to it. Like many women, it took me many years to become a feminist, because it took time to find the ideas that gave me a working definition. Once I realized I had a choice, all my activity became anti-sexist. Slowly, it became easier to understand that while my experience was the prejudice I received, books on feminism gave me the language to articulate institutional sexism, misogyny and patriarchy. Together, these ideas gave depth and nuance to complexities of structure in our culture, which beyond each individual, weighed more heavily on women as a global population. What does disability mean to you? Record words and images that come to mind about disability. How do you think we react to these words? What emotions do you think they stir? Compare your responses with mine as we go. Does the space around you feel safe? Or did you encounter sexism, racism, classism, homophobia? Questions. What are the stereotypes of labeled learners? How do these impact on teaching? How do you think these impact labeled learners' learning? Oppression. Recognizing different levels of ableism in classrooms, schools, and education. Prejudice, victimization or disability hate crime, atypical behavior extended towards those labeled. The negative feelings, attitudes or behavior, often fueling a prejudice that is based on unchallenged assumption, or unconscious bias, belief that the other is less deserving of respect. Systemic or institutional discrimination, the unfair disadvantage created by ways of working and or internal barriers that lead to ongoing hindrance or restricted opportunity for those labeled. Social inequality, local culture, affecting organizational narratives where the representation those labeled feed the belief mentioned previously. These are generally so widespread in society they escape direct notice as ableist. Inclusion. Chosen by disabled people, activists within groups including disability studies, the word inclusion was specifically chosen to articulate belonging, unlike integration and mainstreaming which imply the need of those labeled to fit in. To be included in the fullest sense, education, not school practice, needs to change to enable the fullest participation of every possible learner. This articulation also disrupts a belief in a them and us continuum, by proposing an opposition to the implied acceptance of conditionality in existing vocabularies. Disabled activists saw these options as different forms of institutionalization, entrenched by the language of disciplines describing learners as special. Viewed as an alternative, inclusion is a possible North Star, a vision, not a reality. Therefore, while inclusive practice exists, inclusion is not a currently available option, because current alternatives only offer the unsatisfactory limitations imposed by existing classroom and school variation. Which means learners and their families cannot opt for a local school free of prejudice, discrimination and inequality. Because no school space is free of ableism, sexism, racism, classism, homophobia, religious intolerance, and expectation in terms of family choices. Able privilege. Not the luxury of one identity, but the advantage of not having to stand against the expected norm. In school culture, where variation is an anomaly rather than a difference that is planned for. Belonging, therefore, is always jeopardized by culture. In critical disability studies, able privilege was first referred to as hearing privilege, not to describe being deaf, but to highlight the privilege of those not facing autism. The privilege of not being disadvantaged in a hearing society, a world that denies sign, BSL, as a language. Now think of the impact of Rose's presence on Strictly, with the 488% rise in searches for learning sign language on Google. The notion of able as a norm, not other, defines the disadvantage the group faces, not their identity. As a concept, it is the privilege that is unearned, as it is afforded to those who not need to prove their humanity repeatedly. Able privilege, relative to non-disabled people, is not having to face ableism by reason of difference. A learner, therefore, need not identify for others to articulate the characteristic discrimination, ableism, many are subject to. The discrimination and inequality imposed on the labeled school population more widely, it is equivalent to the sexism women experience, a disadvantage that impacts on them negatively, as a characteristic myriad of setbacks. In gender terms, there's a difference between misogyny and patriarchy in the language of feminism that writers on matters of disability equality have yet to name. Currently there is a dearth of disability-specific terminology to describe with nuance in identity, prejudice, impairment, discrimination and inequality. Misrepresentation. People trust their personal experience rather than attempting to address their assumptions with research evidence or working wisdom. Their own voice is louder than the alternatives offered by disabled people, but the ideas imposed by society more widely. Ableism is written into organizational accounts, in documents such as research, reviews, and textbooks, as many writers fail to name the negative impact of schooling on the labeled population. Our textual world fails to articulate an opposition to the institutional discrimination within education or inequality in society more widely. The very phrase special educational needs creates a space in which we can cast out those we find ourselves unwilling to teach. Ironically, the phrase was introduced to get away from diagnosis, by putting emphasis on the support being special, not the learner. Like so many disciplines, education has sidelined disability as a separate body of knowledge. Labeling learners then allows us to speak of them as outsiders in a narrative about attainment, achievement and success, where those entitled to support become those who threaten higher outcomes. Think of leveling up currently. Institutional norms, and society's narratives, shape our professional ideas about our everyday practice. We might be aware of unfair rules or expectations, having encountered them ourselves as barriers. Other beliefs may be so deeply buried in our ways of working that we rarely question them at all. So, how do we build confidence in articulating the stereotypes that lead to bias and spot the barriers that hinder progress? It is not up to disabled employees or disabled clients to be more fluent about their experience. Forests of documents on this topic already exist. The onus is on us as business leaders to articulate the barriers facing the disabled population in terms of discrimination and inequality. Questions. How does misrepresentations reveal itself in text? How does this affect storytelling in education and society more broadly? Learning to unlearn. There are 5 myths that broadly distort the way we talk about disability and special needs that misrepresents labeled learners in educational storytelling. These create, and maintain, stereotypes in the presentation of disabled individuals, groups, communities and society. Distortions reinforce ideas that deny the experience of individual learner, the knowledge of disciplines, and therefore the interests of those labeled within the population more widely. Myth 1. Illness and institutional practice. Where in conversation and in documents words for diagnosis, illness and disability are used interchangeably, need is seen as an individual problem in need of cure. As a problem it is perceived as a personal issue, and largely for someone else's expertise or budget. Where practice is seen as unchangeable, or professionals will not change their expectations, labeled learners are more likely to be sent elsewhere. Myth 2. Scale. The real number of learners who could identify as requiring support is large, 1 or 2 in 10. Some may have a visible difference, while many do not. It's good practice, therefore, to articulate this population as a global majority, rather than a minority group, thus putting the need to change on the institution, not the learners. Myth 3. Fitting in. Labeled learners are often viewed as completely separate group, needing segregated schools or isolated units. Yet labeled learners are among the women and girls, LGBTQ+, Black and people of color, that we refer to as minorities. This separation tends to draw a continuum between those considered mainstream and others. Furthermore, using subgroups, such as mild or severe difficulties, rather than part of a bigger population facing multiple barriers. This allows the idea of privilege is viewed as a luxury, not an absence of disadvantage. Myth 5. Organizational silence. Because of the ideas around diagnosis, as a group labeled learners are often seen as the responsibility of other departments, organizations or institutions, rather than the cost to society of not educating, or poorly teaching, labeled learners. It would be better to see special educational in every classroom, and any cost as a good investment that secures benefits in whole localities and the well-being of communities more widely. Myth 6. Personal private boundaries. In many conversations about facing added barriers, more specifically about disclosure, impairment and identity are often conflated. This means that discrimination and inequality are often ignored, with the focus of what's wrong imposed on the labeled individual. For example, when saying they have a disability rather than they are disabled. Left unchallenged, these myths, often evident in stereotypes, lead to prejudice, a reaction to the myth, not the person. Reactive practice, such as the justifications for not working with disabled people, keeps assumptions going. The good news is that once these ideas are more clearly articulated, they are more easily recognized in conversation, and more easily avoided in text. Questions for research. I undertook my research because, as a governor, I was continually baffled by the lack of reference to the voice of disabled people, deaf and disabled people's organizations or disability equality in strategic conversation. While the people around me were sometimes fluent in their idea of feminism, they had no language to articulate the discrimination imposed on the disabled population. As I once described it, you could put 10 feminists in a room and get 10 definitions, but few could put a single word to the widespread and toxic nature of the inequality imposed on the disabled population. Omitting the situation disabled people face from strategic conversation does little to include their experience in storytelling more widely. Rather, it makes us believe their ideas are irrelevant to many conversations, some of which affect them directly. When it comes to matters relating to disability, many don't know what they do not know. Which means many often ignore, reinvent, or distort disabled people's interests based on the tales they've heard about them. Trust is key because positive exchanges are banked, and leads to a mutual respect that builds up over time. Questions. How does this impact on practice, school organization and policy? Compare your responses with my story so far. Don't call me special. A large number of disabled people, especially the activists among the disabled population, do not like the word special. We believe our needs are not special, they are the human needs we all have according to the United Nations. Sadly, our rights to education are often denied because of the lack of support we need to be able to take for granted. What is special? If anything, it could be seen as the way we get our needs met. The big parking spaces, ramps, automatic doors, accessible toilets, straws, lifts, level classrooms, differentiated materials, etc. These level the field in an otherwise discriminatory and inequitable world. Speaking with authority. Amplifying voice. Professional wisdom is a beautiful thing, especially when applied to teaching practice and school relationships. As research suggests, the difference between political correctness and respectful language is not whether a word is right or wrong, but whether the meaning strengthens or counters a narrative that exists in storytelling. The critique here is that special often strengthens an ableist narrative, particularly when used to mean labeled, but less so if it is used to mean disadvantaged by discrimination and inequality. While many labeled learners enjoy their lives at school, it is most probable that most, or their families, have struggled to have their rights to education upheld to begin with. See Session 1. Language reveals a lot about school culture, and equally it is educational storytelling that tells us about what matters to us as professionals. It would be wrong to think of educational space as free of prejudice, disadvantage and inequality. Few educators speak from a position that acknowledges what is said by those marginalized within education and in society more widely. Consequently, in school spaces where disability and ableism is never spoken of, it's far more likely that discrimination will flourish, because it isn't spotted or disrupted. The result is a silence, a lack of parity on a great scale, because the number of those facing its negative impact is large. Many of us underestimate the scale of inequality imposed on labeled learners by education, and therefore the cost imposed by the institution on society as a whole. As research suggests, the difference between political correctness and respectful language is not whether a word is right or wrong, but why the meaning strengthens or counters a narrative that exists in everyday storytelling. The language we use about disability is typically negative and often medical. Professionals will often feel more comfortable talking about a diagnosis, impairment or conditions, than discrimination and inequality. Also, we often talk in ways that merely repeat the stereotypes we've internalized in everyday conversations. Current terminology is limited. For example, the word disability is used to indicate personal difference, labeled group and inequality. It's not whether particular words are right or wrong. Respectful language encourages each of us to think about the meaning and the context of our choice. Error is rarely as problematic as silence. Most people are fairly flexible, as long as we feel others are mindful about the words used. There are often unclear boundaries between private matters, group interest and public debate. In organization documents, terminology is far more critical, because it is with the language that an organization's culture is defined. Disabled people's voices, as divergent storytellers, are required to address the stories told that are presently distorted by conjecture, myths and assumptions. The authors of disabled people's interests are the voices that need acknowledging as contributors to knowledge. Implications for education. At school level, the issue is greater than a lack of fit, since labeled learners have no less readiness, curiosity and enthusiasm than their non-labeled peers. While all types of impairment, condition and difference have been successfully accommodated somewhere, it still seems barriers are substantial for far too many. Overall, better practice is patchy. Those labeled still face far greater barriers than most professionals imagine. For school leaders, the challenge is therefore to view a change in culture as a benefit to both to those affected by discrimination and the wider inequality imposed on the wider school community. Positive action, therefore, needs to address both discrimination and inequality strategically. It is not up to disabled teachers, or those labeled SEN, to be more fluent about their experience. Forests of documents on this topic already exist. The onus is on us, as teachers, scholars, and leadership teams, to articulate more clearly the injustice imposed whole school populations. At the heart of ethical responsibility is in an imperative to take equality seriously as a route to safer environments, learning spaces. Furthermore, the distinctive nature of the disadvantage labeled learners face is an indirect cost to society. Therefore, more equitable participation is both an investment in their well-being and a far cheaper option for communities over time. This responsibility requires understanding of evidence at senior management, leadership teams and trustee levels. In order to avoid the time-consuming and costly tweaks at operational level that rarely alter culture or educational purpose. Different conversations at different levels. Be specific. Talk to individuals about groups and proportions of stated population in different ways. Individual, small changes need to be put in place to remove, minimize, and reduce the impact of the barriers and prejudice imposed on learners irrespective of a label. Organizational, having established a conversation about the barriers, articulating the language and culture faced by some learners, greater confidence will be available to address systemic issues and name outside influence. Institutional, educate the sector with the intent of taking knowledge from the school to beyond. Practice, purpose and vision may need to change. Direction, from a responsible and ethical perspective means moving towards anti-ableist intent as a way of leveling the field, addressing inequality and aligning to the Sustainable Development Goals. Adopting an allied position. An allied response demands action that needs to prioritize the interests of those labeled as they are most disadvantaged, before extending to those who benefit from able privilege. Just any effort isn't sufficient. Practice needs to be with the right effort and have a deliberate direction. While good, best and proactive practice sometimes equate, operational can be strategic, but rarely unintentionally. Because being better at treating learners unfairly will not achieve more equitable outcomes. Practice might need to change to avoid the very activity that compounds the structural inequality experienced by so many. Addressing discrimination and inequality simultaneously is like tapping your head while rubbing your tummy. Different actions are required at class, school and educational levels. I typically start a disability equality training session with a language exercise which helps people appreciate how deeply stereotypes are woven into our everyday language. I ask people to name misrepresentation. It takes a few minutes, because they often don't appear obvious. But given a few examples, people can generally fill a flip chart sheet in minutes and beg for more. It's not that they don't recognize words that harm, it's that they have no idea why some words do or others don't. They have relied on individuals' preference to make choices that require more understanding than mere likability. For example, my mate Joe likes Difabald, or another they say brainstorm is wrong. In Joe's case, there's no way of telling if Tom, Dick or Francis likes what Joe likes. As for finding the they, if indeed they exist, it's usually hearsay or urban legend, not an explicit directive based on individual or group. Unfortunately, we tend to link stereotype to personal deficit, organizational reaction, and society rejection or blame. For example, stupid becomes hard to educate, becomes special educational needs, becomes segregated. Once we've established the pattern, it's easy to see how culture leads can abuse. It's not the personal difference that leads to bad experience, more the lack of typical protection offers by not being treated unfairly. Unless we understand the cycle, blame can be laid on the individual. Allies are those who can name the stereotypes, the patterns and the cycles of disability misrepresentation in language and culture. My safety in a room often rests on the quick response of others to negative assumptions. As anti-ableists, it's life-affirming for me to see colleagues point out the words, phrases or idioms that harm. These are those which carry assumptions about the normality of perfect bodies, the language that creates the ideas that those without difference are normal, sick, sick, sick. It's not the words themselves that are good or bad, it's their meaning in a particular context. It is the idea that some are able, implying others are not, that needs challenging, not the ignorance of those speaking. These days, with the increasing use of the word ableism, it's far easier to introduce people to the notion of a shared oppression, akin to classism, racism and sexism, that is imposed by culture. Viewed that way, identity and activism still hugely important, do not stand in the way of anyone addressing injustice. Outward-looking stance against ableism frees us up to stand beside, not above or in front, of those in receipt of contempt. For example, I stand against homophobia, not because of my experience, but because it adds insult to inequality and gives credence to disability studies. Seeking and responding to lived experience is essential yet an unsatisfactory minimum, as it only addresses the prejudice and barriers at individual level. Furthermore, we can't ask every labeled learner in turn what they understand by discrimination, without imposing on their time and generosity. We have to trust the voices those who have also gained research evidence and professional wisdom on these matters. Disability studies give us frame, a language, like torchlight in the darkness, that highlights a specific sensitivity to ableism. As feminism gives us a sensitivity to the male gaze. Through its theoretical lens, it helps us question the ableism in ideology by highlighting misrepresentation in discourse. For example, Oliver refers to alternative ways of questioning experience. The medical model as asking the question, "What is wrong with you?" And the social model as asking the question, "What is wrong with society?" Critical disability studies. Critical theory is fundamentally about reflection for action, not a denial of existing ideas about education, but the addition of a recognizable voice to emerging discussion. In the same way feminism doesn't deny women's experience, but seeks to frame it as a personal experience, within institutional disadvantage and a global consciousness hidden beyond the orthodox nature of the male gaze. Without a definition, there is no feminist or critical race, gender, class theory. Similarly, an anti-ableist sensitivity is essential to the ethical practitioner wishing to deploy their skills in strategic ways to disrupt, interrupt, or counter ableism in culture. Lack of accountability. The medical model, also known as the individual or deficit model of disability, focuses on the person's difficulties and how these may be remediated or compensated for. Notice how society talks at disabled people. Responsibility. The social model, also referred to as an inclusive model of disability, focuses on the difficulties presented by society hindering the full participation of labeled learners. Accountability is the naming of an individualized and medicalized assumption about labeled learners. As a tool, or a theory, the medical model articulates the assumptions that labeled learners need to overcome deficit or be sent to remedial intervention to become school-ready. This is impossible for most, as would impose expensive treatment to make a normal learner, because normal does not exist. This is a nuanced articulation of the school environment, with personal access, needs, and difference being acknowledged within and not simply the all that often sees personal experience ignored to the point of denying effort or pain. Society listens to disabled people. Social model and lived experience. The social model proposes storytelling in which the disabled population are viewed as being disabled by institutional and societal culture. Naming this ableism frames the problem as one of language, practice and procedures that disadvantage the learner. Identifying ableism helps us think about how educational spaces need to change to offer a safe, fair, and equitable experience rather than the prejudice, discrimination and inequality that exists today. The legitimacy gap. The medical model, in disability studies, is a shorthand for lack of accountability in the response to disabled people as a population. Think back to ethical crises in session 1. The legitimacy gap refers to the amount education storytelling differs from the interests of the disabled population by being replaced by misrepresentation. Schools who acknowledge the significance of voice and theory will more ably respond in personal, internal and external exchanges by articulating clearly barriers, discrimination and injustice. For many, critical disability studies helps achieve legitimacy in practice by closing a gap in mainstream beliefs, ideology, by adding disabled people's interests to ethical considerations in leadership conversation. Practice and knowledge. Making the research educational storytelling accountable to disabled people as a group is not the responsibility of a single researcher, one policy or a separate department. The idea that disability has a standalone file conflicts with the idea that everyone should be able to respond willingly and effectively to address discrimination. The task is to call out environments that impose disadvantage. The responsibility is shared. Accountability has two essential aspects, namely doing the right thing, performance, and giving an account of it, reporting. Professionals who can articulate the medical model's significance will respond with more legitimacy in conversation by framing systemic issues as barriers, inequality, and injustice. Accountability and responsibility. Where accountability is sought as the ability to respond to those labeled as citizens included in civil rights movement, thus accounting for all those who have a right to the story that is told, as authors not bystanders. Responsibility can then be understood as an ongoing conversation to secure well-being outcomes, uphold human rights, and empower the members of organizations and the constituency they serve. Storytelling. Ableism. Ableism, a specific type of oppression, akin to homophobia, racism, classism, ageism, and sexism, held in the culture and language that inform society's debates. Anti-ableist, a defined position against ableism, a characteristic oppression that disabled people face, as in feminist or anti-racist. Theorizing, for example, with an anti-ableist legitimacy involves explicit reference to disabled people as tellers in a storytelling that holds their interests at their heart. Disabled storytellers and alternative storytelling. This talk provides ideas that will help you to think with increasing confidence about the individual, labeled learner, their skills, experience, and knowledge. Discrimination, the barriers, negative attitudes, and working practices faced by those labeled but not by their peers within organizations, sectors, or professions, for example, fear, lack of awareness, avoidance, microaggression, stares, complex or incomplete policies. Ableism, the misrepresentation or silencing in the documents, communications, and wider storytelling of organizations. Impairment, condition, difference or functioning, private information, the disclosure of which is an individual's choice. The same is true for their identity as a disabled person. Inclusive practice, an ongoing process of adjusting equitably to diversity. It is all very good news for addressing the prejudice, discrimination, and inequality.